Hello there, and welcome to the second part in my three-part series where I give an overview of the transit of my home city of Philadelphia. And it's time where we get to the most talked of, most eclectic, and perhaps most controversial facet of Philly's transit, those being the rapid transit lines that serve the city. While the previously discussed regional rail system has complaints about it mostly stemming from the fact that its service is not as frequent as it could be, those could be argued to be first world problems compared to some of the issues that some of the rapid transit lines face. And I say some because between the four rapid transit lines that serve the city and the region, thoughts about them can vary wildly from line to line, which is hard to say about a lot of other cities, especially since there's usually a pretty uniform opinion that tends to form about rapid transit operations. The same cannot truly be said for Philadelphia, but at the same time, the most negative perceptions tend to be the most dominant ones that the layman might get when it comes to Philly rapid transit. That being said, it's far from being all negative either. And like regional rail, the rapid transit lines have both positives and vast potential, all of which I want to bring up as we go through an explanation of rapid transit in Philadelphia. Before we go further, it's time for us to introduce the players once again. Yet again, the main subject of discussion when it comes to our operators is our old friend SEPTA, who runs 3 of the 4 rapid transit lines that serve the city. It's also quite possibly the city's biggest punching bag as a result of these lines, which is really sad to see, honestly. The second operator and owner of the 4th rapid transit line to serve the city is the Port Authority Transit Corporation, or PATCO, who I'll delve into later on in the video. Now immediately you might say, this is a weird way to run a rapid transit system, which is that you have a line that's completely separate from a user's standpoint from the rest of the network, requiring a whole different ticket and fare system to be able to use it no less. So why? Well, let's start first by understanding the lines in question. The 4 rapid transit lines that I'll be mentioning here today, and I know some are annoyed that I say 4 rather than 3, will be the Market-Frankford line, shown in blue, the Broad Street line, shown in orange, the Norristown High-Speed line, shown in purple, and the PATCO Speed line in red. And I'll be going through each of these lines one at a time, giving an explanation as to their services, because they are quite different from each other. Let's start things off with Philly's oldest rapid transit line, the Market-Frankford line, better known to most people around here as the L, for reasons that may become obvious with a ride on it. The Market-Frankford line was opened in stages between 1907 and 1922, and runs between 69th Street Transportation Center in Upper Darby before ascending onto an elevated track above Market Street through West Philadelphia, thus giving the line its nickname and part of its current name. After the line gets to 46th Street, the line goes underground as it nears and runs through Center City. In fact, this section of the line was once elevated all the way as far as the crossing of the Schuylkill River, but it was moved into a tunnel in the 1950s, with the tunnel also serving as a subway tunnel for 5 trolley lines that serve West Philadelphia and Center City, which I'll talk about in my next video. After moving through Center City underground, serving the likes of University City at 34th Street, 30th Street Station, Philadelphia City Hall at 15th Street where it connects with the Broad Street line, the Fashion District, Reading Terminal, and Jefferson Station at 11th Street, 2 of the other rapid transit lines and the Broad Street line, again, I'll explain later, and the PATCO Speed Line at 8th Street, Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell, and the Constitution Center at 5th Street, and the Old City at 2nd Street, the line that emerges out of the tunnel and into the light, right into the median of Interstate 95 before stopping at Spring Garden, a station so aggravating in its idea alone that Alan Fisher had to make a video about how dumb it and similar stations can be. After a very pleasant waiting experience at Spring Garden, the line continues elevated above Front Street until it joins the notorious Kensington Avenue into the similarly notorious North Philly neighborhood of the same name until it gets to Frankford Avenue, the second main namesake of the line, before it reaches its end terminal at Frankford Transportation Center after a trip time of about 40 minutes, with train frequencies every 7 minutes or better. The termini of the line are very important transit connections for the rest of the city, with Frankfurt and 69th serving as major termini not just for the rapid transit service, but for numerous bus and even trolley bus routes in the case of the former, while 69th Street is a terminus of another rapid transit line, the Norristown high-speed line, and a few trolley routes that we'll talk about later. Now, the reason why the Market-Frankford line is particularly infamous, perhaps being the most infamous transit service in the city, has to do largely with the neighborhoods it passes through. While Center City, University City, and some points beyond them are perfectly fine, and some areas that the line serves around Girard Avenue can be described as up and coming, other areas that it serves, including some parts of West Philly and especially North Philly, and two of the most notorious neighborhoods that the line serves, Frankfurt and especially Kensington, have a rather sordid reputation for multiple reasons. This is reflected in the patronage of the Market-Frankford line, which unfortunately by proxy has become infamous for substance use and vagrancy, and being generally dirty and unappealing, especially in these parts of the line and particularly so at night. That being said, does the L really deserve that reputation? Well, I'd say it's kinda subjective in some regards. There have been more than plenty of times where I've taken the L, particularly as a walking accelerator through Center City and as a way to get between the city and the suburban trolley and bus lines, and it was pretty unremarkable. There were definitely aspects of any given trip on the L that I wasn't the biggest fan of, but there are issues that one could have with most transit systems in the US, from crowded trains to lackluster cleaning to fare evasion, which SEPTA at least seems to be redoubling efforts to tackle in recent months. In fact, I've even seen my fair share of New Yorkers get into arguments with Philadelphians online that stations on the New York City subway are worse. Not exactly an enviable contest, guys. That being said, there have also been times where I've seen awkward situations on the L. Not exactly dangerous to me personally, but certain ones that a lot of riders would find off-putting, and certainly some have seen way worse. For the most part though, the L does serve its purpose rather well, though I think anyone can agree that it's not exactly the most polished or well-presented and appealing metro line out there. The stations on the L have something of a bad reputation for being dirty and under-maintained and just generally uninviting, as if they're places you're not supposed to like being in. And I mean, just look at these sorts of arrangements here for instance. And that's true at a fair few stations. But it's not fair to say SEPTA's just giving up on them. In fact, whenever SEPTA announces a deep clean at a station on any line, particularly the L, they get a lot of praise for it, along with people complaining on why it ever got that bad in the first place, because, well, naturally. And that's to say nothing of the genuinely good stations on the L, like 5th Street Independence Hall and most notably 30th Street. Oh, sorry, Drexel Station at 30th Street, even though Drexel's closer to 34th Street than 30th, but I digress, where the stations have gotten or are getting wholesale renovations, which really help make it seem like you're not stuck in a dirty, dingy box waiting for your train. Albeit the main reason can ultimately be described as making these stations more appealing for the tourists who are likely to use them, as opposed to other stations like, say, here at 11th Street. I wouldn't consider this overpass to get to the opposite platforms particularly appealing, just saying. It just makes riding the L feel more like the train you shouldn't take unless you have to. Add to the fact that since the line is entirely double-tracked with only passing switches to deal with any sorts of disruptions, and the Market-Frankford line is the most common route to see bus substitutions if things go slightly wrong with it, alongside backlogs from delays creating the frankly annoying situation of 3 or 4 trains passing in the opposite direction of where you're going, passing through the station before your train finally shows up. Ugh. Speaking of the trains, Philly is definitely a unique metro system for the fact that every single line on the network uses their own bespoke trains, which is helped by the fact that, officially, none of the lines in Philly's network are connected to each other. In fact, the Market-Frankford line is completely isolated from the rest of the network, and it even runs on a different track gauge than any other metro line, as it runs on 5-foot 2¼ Pennsylvania trolley gauge tracks, whereas the other 3 lines all run the normal 4-foot 8½ standard gauge that you see on most rail lines in the US and worldwide for that matter. Sadly, in the case of the L, the use of bespoke trains on the line has proven to be a detriment, at least in the case of the trains that they currently have. The L's current cars, known as the M4s, were built in the late 1990s by Adtrans and ABB. And sadly, they were considered to be pretty meh when they were new, and even worse, they really haven't aged with grace as the years have gone on. Aside from the general complaints about the line and its cleanliness issues that have rubbed off on the cars have had continual maintenance problems in recent years, including a case back in 2017 when 90 of the cars were removed from service due to fatigue cracks in several components. And from a rider's standpoint, I think the main thing everyone will agree is that the noise proofing in these cars leaves a lot to be desired. Even though they are by far the youngest of Philadelphia's subway cars, the M4 seem to be not long for this world, as SEPTA was recently granted over $300 million in federal transit funding to obtain replacements. And it seems like replacing them is one of the highest priority items for the agency, which given their poor streak as of late is definitely for the best. Even though the cars are only just over 25 years old when plenty of other cars on two of the other lines are getting close to twice that age. And in fact, as I wrote up the script for this video, it was revealed that SEPTA has selected Hitachi as the builder of the new cars for the line, which is good since Hitachi's a proven commodity of a builder who have built cars for the Washington Metro and the Miami Metro, along with the upcoming cars on the Baltimore subway link. So it seems like SEPTA's off to a good start with the needed updates to this vital corridor, which is the most used rail corridor in Philadelphia, period. Alongside that, I can see new cars as an opportunity to give the line a much needed upgrade and overhauls. All in all, the L is probably the main reason as to why Philly's subways have a less than stellar reputation. And while it can be fine for a good number of trips, the negative image is understandable. And there are certain places it serves where some may not exactly feel comfortable traveling to if you're sampling it for the first time, though its future does hold incredible potential, and thankfully, some of it is being capitalized on with station upgrades and new trains. But are the other lines able to make up for the L's shortcomings in the here and now? Well, let's take a look at the other main subway line serving the city proper, the Broad Street line, to find out. Opened in 1929 and built out in phases to its current extent by 1973, the Broad Street line, as its name implies, runs primarily north-south under Broad Street, one of the main arterial roads in the city. Beginning its run at its maintenance yard at Fern Rock Transportation Center, where passengers can connect with SEPTA's regional rail network, the line passes through the northern neighborhoods of Logan, Hunting Park, Glenwood, Cecil B. Moore, and Francisville until it reaches a junction point before Fairmount Station. After Fairmount, most trains continue south, while others dive under the main line and serve a separate below-level platform at Fairmount Station before breaking off to the southeast to continue on what is known as the Broad Ridge Spur. The Spur is rather short, serving only 2 stations, down from 3 before, and was made as a way to follow through in part on the idea of an envisioned loop line around Center City for a massive subway network that was planned but never really came to fruition. But today, the line still has a purpose to serve as it heads down Ridge Avenue to 8th and Market to connect both the Market-Frankford line and the PATCO Speedline at one stop. Perhaps most important of all though, the main intermediate stop on the Spur serves Philly's Chinatown, a place I say is always worth a visit if you get a chance to, even if the station itself is hot garbage from a land use standpoint. Like, seriously, this is what you see coming out of the station. A subway station, in the middle of a major city. Are they mental? I'm getting off topic here. Back on the main line though, from Fairmount, the line continues south to the most used and arguably most infamous stop on the line, City Hall Station, which, being the most used station on the Broad Street line, not only serves Center City, as well as its namesake of Philadelphia City Hall, but is also a connecting point with the Market-Frankford line and the parallel trolley lines. And if you look hard enough through the underground labyrinth or are willing to brave traffic, it also connects to Suburban Station, one of the main regional rail stations of the city that I talked about in my previous video. Now, the reason I describe City Hall as infamous is twofold. One is that wayfinding can be really tricky for the uninitiated, even with improvements to signage in recent months. and the other being the aforementioned cleanliness issues that really become noticeable here. I find it rather ironic in a sense that the most heavily used station on the line is also its poster child for its cleanliness concerns, especially since, honestly, there are several stations on the Broad Street line that I argue look pretty decent, at least at platform level, and some of them even have really nice public art built into them. Plus, I always like the New York City subway-esque tiling motif on a lot of stations on this line. It kind of gives them a bit more character than a lot of stops on the L if you ask me. Anyways, continuing south out of City Hall, the line then serves Washington Square and then goes through the neighborhoods of South Philly all the way down to the end terminus of the line. Originally known as Pattison after the adjacent Pattison Avenue, the line is today known as NRG Station due to a sponsorship deal, particularly since the station serves the South Philadelphia Sports Complex, which is home to every major sports franchise you've ever heard of in Philly, made up of Lincoln Financial Field, home of the Philadelphia Eagles, Citizens Bank Park, home of the Phillies, and the Wells Fargo Center, home of both the Philadelphia Flyers and the Philadelphia 76ers. Well, for now anyway, given the plans that the Sixers have. Given how much of a parking nightmare games tend to be around here, my family, my friends, and I almost always go to games at the complex using the Broad Street line, even as someone who lives in the suburbs. Regional Rail plus the Broad Street line is the winning choice for me. That, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper than spending $45 for parking for an Eagles game. No, I'm not making that up. The Broad Street line even runs special Sports Express services for games, and it makes the line even more well suited to handling big game day crowds than even the best parking lot could even fathom. Oh, and speaking of expresses, one of the unique features of the Broad Street line, and something I don't think I've seen on any other North American subway line that's not in New York or Chicago, is the fact that the Broad Street line has dedicated express tracks. The express tracks run all the way from Fern Rock and continue in a 4-track configuration until Lombard South Station, 2 stops south from City Hall. The express train skips stops after Olney Transportation Center, the first stop after Fern Rock, skipping 8 stops on the route between Fern Rock and the terminus of the expresses at Walnut Locust Station, completing that run in 20 minutes, 10 minutes faster than a local, though you would still have to transfer to a local train to continue further south, as opposed to the local's 1-seat ride for the whole route. As for the trains they use on this line, it's definitely a much better story than on the L here if you ask me. The Broad Street line's B4 cars were built by Kawasaki in the early 80s, and aside from having a more conventional subway interior that I think is better suited to the services they run, as opposed to the "we have the Washington Metro at home" configuration you get from the L, which is helped by the fact that the Broad Street line has an utterly massive loading gauge for an older subway line compared to the L, resulting in the trains being physically bigger and way more spacious. The Broad Street line cars have aged much better for both crews and riders alike than the M4s, and they've been pretty reliable, not suffering from any major reliability faults as of late from what I've been able to see. They've kind of become the Silverliner 4s of Philly subway trains, and unlike the M4s, there currently isn't a big push to replace them with new stock. Though with the trains just passing their 40th birthday, I wouldn't be shocked if there's some thoughts on the matter poking and prodding around. Overall though, while neighborhoods in North Philadelphia don't generally get the greatest reputation, I find myself liking the Broad Street line a fair bit more than the L. It generally feels better aesthetically, even with the cleanliness issues at a good number of stations. The stations in general though, they give me a lot more to like pound for pound, and the services they run are a lot more flexible and I find are less susceptible to backlogs and delays than the L can get. Just try at the very least to have fun while you're solving the labyrinth that is City Hall Station. Rounding out the lines that are run by SEPTA, it's high time to discuss probably the most controversial choice to include in this video, the Norristown High-Speed Line, which in my opinion is not only one of the most unique and quirky lines in Philly's system, but it's one that's really grown on me in the last little while. Built as an interurban line by the Philadelphia and Western Railroad in 1907 to its former terminus at Stratford, with its current route to Norristown being completed in 1912, the Norristown High-Speed Line, also known as the Route 100, is one of those services that people aren't quite sure how to classify at times. It's definitely not a metro line in the traditional sense, and was built more as a very fast interurban trolley service than a conventional metro line, particularly as it doesn't serve the city proper other than at its southern terminus at 69th Street, and even then that's debatable, where of course the line connects with the L. The 13-mile route serves 22 stops, taking about half an hour as it runs through Upper Darby, Haverford, Radnor, Upper and Lower Merion, and Bridgeport on its way to Norristown Transportation Center, where it connects with the Manayunk-Norristown Regional Rail Line and numerous bus lines. Now, the uniqueness of the line is pretty evident in the trains they run here. The N5 cars, built by ABB Traction in the early 1990s, seem like a strange mix of a trolley and a subway car, and the interior feels more akin to a regional rail train than any kind of metro equipment that SEPTA owns. They're also really quick, with a top operating speed of 75 miles an hour, and while you'll often see them run as single cars, they'll run two-car trains in rush hours. And plus, I find them to be among the more comfortable cars to ride on SEPTA's network. There's been a lot of ink that's been spilled in transit circles about the benefits of loop lines, those being transit lines that serve areas around the perimeter of a city rather than strictly the city center, can have, and the Norristown High-Speed Line can be a fine example of that. The NHSL is really the main non-car transit link for a lot of people going north and south that aren't going to Center City directly, with those that do finding connections available to the aforementioned L at 69th Street, the Manayunk-Norristown line at Norristown, and almost a connection with the Paoli-Thorndale line at Radnor, along with, of course, the suburban bus routes that SEPTA runs, including a few, namely the 103 and the 104, that were former trolley lines. No, I'm totally not bitter about that, why do you ask? For people who want to take a jaunt out to the near suburbs of the city or want to find a different way to get around the suburbs, the Norristown High-Speed Line is one to consider. And while I definitely have my critiques, it doesn't really drag my opinion down a bit too much, even if the proposed extension to King of Prussia that was axed last year was definitely going to be ridiculously stupid in its execution. On the whole though, the line is really good. It can definitely be improved of course, and I can think of a few places that loop lines like the NHSL would be invaluable. It's an interesting example for all of us. In that sense, the NHSL could serve as an inspiration to others, and for those purposes, a ride on it would be worth it. And with these first three lines mentioned all being run by SEPTA, the fare on them all is the same, $2.50 in cash or $2 with the key card or contactless credit cards, which, unlike regional rail, makes things a lot more approachable by comparison to newcomers. However, as we arrive on the last route to discuss today, that approachability starts to go out the window, as we move to the only rapid transit line in Philly that's not run by SEPTA, the PATCO Speedline. Originally known as the Bridge Line, the line initially opened in 1936 as a link between Philadelphia and Camden over the then new Ben Franklin Bridge. Yes, that train you see going over the Ben Franklin Bridge, that's the PATCO train. And yes, the views you get going over the bridge are amazing. Originally a part of the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Network, the Bridge Line would be leased to the Delaware River Port Authority by the city as far as the line's Philadelphia terminus at 15th, 16th, and Locust Station until it gets to the Ben Franklin Bridge, with the line over the bridge and beyond being owned outright by the Port Authority. The line begins as mentioned at 15th, 16th, and Locust, perhaps my least favorite terminus station in all of the city, and that's saying something due to its cramped, dingy nature, largely due to it never being designed as a terminus station in the first place for reasons I'll discuss in the future. Add to that its rampant cleanliness issues, and I usually just walk to the next station on the line to get on most of the time, continuing underground under Locust Street for 2 stops, before turning north to stop at 8th and Market, where not only does it connect with the Market-Frankford line and the Broadridge Spur, but if you look out the left side of the train heading towards the bridge, you can even see the platform for the Broadridge Spur's Chinatown station as it approaches to run parallel to the PATCO line before it arrives at 8th and Market. From there, the train passes the long-abandoned station at Franklin Square, which is actually reopening next year, and I'll be making a video on that when it opens, before it heads over the bridge to Camden, New Jersey, stopping at City Hall Station, not that one, and Broadway Station, before continuing on a newly built section of the line made specifically by the Port Authority for the new Speedline service in 1969. True to its name, the line picks up speed as it races through South Jersey, serving stops in Collingswood, Haddonfield, Cherry Hill, and Voorhees before reaching its final terminus of Lindenwold, 14 miles from the city, where one can connect with New Jersey Transit's Atlantic City line that I talked about in my last video, and a few bus lines, with a full trip taking about half an hour, which all told made it the fastest metro line in the country when the PATCO Speedline service was launched, and it's still pretty quick to this day. In many ways, the PATCO Speedline became a prototype for the Great Society metros that would appear in the 1970s and 80s, they being the likes of the Washington Metro, BART in the San Francisco Bay Area, and MARTA in Atlanta. And honestly, they could serve as a proof of concept for any future city that finally wants to smell the roses and invest in rapid transit rather than waste billions of dollars on counterproductive highway infrastructure for no benefit. But anyways, PATCO is not only operationally very different, being more like a regional rail line in some regards than a rapid transit line, in a way similar to the PATH system in the New York City area, but the ownership of the PATCO line not falling under SEPTA control brings its own quirks all its own, not least of which is the fare structure. First of all, the key card doesn't work with PATCO. Sorry. Also, there's no free transfer either like there is between the L, the Broad Street line, and the subway surface trolleys. This is one where you inevitably have to pay to transfer onto. And in this case, PATCO even has its own transit card, called the Freedom Card. Yes, really. Whether it be on the Freedom Card or just a regular ticket you get with one of their vending machines, a ride on the PATCO train will vary between $1.40 for a trip between the 4, soon to be 5, stops within Philadelphia, all the way up to $3 for a trip between Philly and Lindenwold, and $6 for a round trip, creating its own little version of zone-based fares like with SEPTA Regional Rail. Overall though, while a single trip may be a bit more expensive, it's certainly not a bad deal in any case. And while culture shock and incompatibility may be confusing for first-time riders, I don't think it's the hardest one to get the gist of. And I think any of us can agree it's a hell of a lot easier than New Jersey Transit's bus fares. More in the future. As for the trains they use, the first thing one may notice from a rider's perspective is that the seating layout feels a lot more like a conventional commuter train than it does a subway service. And I'd say it's tied with the NHSL for being the most comfortable rapid transit train seats in the Philly region. It's really no wonder that this style was adapted to an extent for trains like on the Washington Metro, for example, for those that did it right, or the M4s on the Market-Frankford line of an example of it done less right. As for the trains themselves, PATCO runs by far the oldest trains on Philly's rapid transit lines, with some of the original Bud-built PATCO 1 cars built for the Speedline service in 1968 still running with major refits and refurbishments over the years, and the 1980s vintage PATCO 2 cars built by Vickers Canada under license from Bud taking over the major duties. It seems that classic meme of Bud don't break really is holding true for these cars, as their refit by Alstom in the 2000s and early 2010s went really smoothly. Amazing, right? On top of that, PATCO was the first metro system in the country to use automatic train operation, which basically means the trains can drive themselves on the line if need be, with the driver mainly coming into play to check the doors and serve as a countermeasure to the computer in times of need. And not only was PATCO the first in the country to have this, it was the second line in the entire world to incorporate this technology, with the first being the Victoria line in London, which opened 3 years prior. If I were to have a gripe with them, it would have to do with the park and ride nature of a lot of the stations beyond Camden. Collingswood and Haddonfield are pretty nice, but a lot of the others, including the terminus at Lindenwold, are just made up as parking lots and transfer stations if you're lucky, and it's really hard to get anywhere you want to go without a car, with the possible exception of this Tim Hortons down the street from Lindenwold Station. Regardless, the Speedline could be an instant favorite among people trying it for the first time. It's fast, reliable most of the time, comfortable, and takes a route that on one side of the Ben Franklin Bridge gives you some of the best views of the city, and on the other side allows a rider in the rush hour direction to point and laugh at the inevitable traffic jam that forms on the Ben Franklin Bridge every weekday. Fun for the whole family, this line is. And for those of you wanting to learn a bit more about this line and what it was supposed to be, definitely check out Alan Fisher's great video on the PATCO Speedline, which I'll link here. All in all, it's a favorite for me in terms of the ridership experience. I'm just hoping that the stations in Philly get a major cleanup, since some parts of them can make the L look like a temple at times. Also, please, please, please make the key card work with PATCO. I literally see no reason why it shouldn't be the case. Come on. In summing up, Philadelphia's rapid transit lines can be described as a mixed bag. On the negative side of things, the Market-Frankford line can definitely live up to the negative stereotypes about the city and its transit system, and I use it most of the time in cases of need. The Broad Street line is better in my experience, though it can have its own issues, and I think there's some areas where improvement is needed. The Norristown high-speed line to me is a must-experience mode of transit to see what wacky kinds of transit are out there. And for a junket tour from South Jersey, I'd do it just to take the PATCO Speedline, since it's a favorite as well, and the trip more than makes up for the shortcomings it has in other departments. When it comes to my overall opinion of the network, I see it in a similar vein to regional rail, in that it has incredible potential that's just not being taken advantage of. I have my own personal theory on what a great subway and rapid transit system in Philly could look like, and I do love the push that's going on to finally, after more than a century build, the Roosevelt Boulevard subway, which would be an extension of the Broad Street line up Roosevelt Boulevard to get a metro line to serve the enormous transit desert of Northeast Philly and take pressure off one of the most dangerous roads in the entire country. Given that the idea of the Boulevard subway has been presented repeatedly for the last 110 years, that's worth its own video. I also have one in the works where I'm going over the history of Philly's rapid transit lines and what they were initially supposed to be, so check it out when that arrives, eventually. With a renewed push across the country to develop and improve rail mass transit in American cities, cities like Philadelphia definitely need to step up to the plate and present to the people a rail system they can be proud of. At present, it isn't really, but like regional rail, it has the bones of a great rapid transit network. It's got plenty of issues, but Philly's rapid transit services belay incredible potential, and one that can not only revive downtrodden communities, but can serve as an incredible positive symbol that things can change for the better, particularly how we get around Philly.